Namaste. Welcome to Atharva Forum. And today I'll be going to specifically discuss about the NCERT Social Science textbook for class 6 and 7, and to be precise, which is called as Our Past Part 1 and 2, with Part 1 for the 6th standard and Part 2 for the 7th standard. We are at a twilight period where just we had this National Education Policy 2020 rolled out, which is quite an ambitious policy, envisages India as the knowledge superpower for the world. And for that to happen, many things have to be put in place. And one of the things is to start looking at our existing curriculum framework as well as textbook in much more detail. And whatever changes they might warrant, to have them at the earliest. So there have been a lot of deliberations from the government side from last year, where there is a joint parliamentary standing committee who has been soliciting comments from all over the country, and they have had several sessions, and people were allowed to even write emails to this committee about the concerns regarding the textbooks. I'm going to concentrate today specifically on the social science, that is history textbook of class 6 and 7, which are called our pasts. And the word past is in the plural form, it's not in the singular form, and that's again for a very deliberate reason. But before I get into the subject proper for my discussion today, I wish to introduce to you the article by one Professor Neeladri Bhattacharya, who was the chief advisor for these textbooks, specifically history textbooks, in the period from 2005 to 2009. So it is in that period that all our textbooks had undergone major changes. And Professor Neeladri Bhattacharya of Jawaharlal Nehru University, who was overseeing this activity, and he had come public about what were the goals, what were the motivations, what were the agenda of the group which he was spearheading while they were trying to replace the textbooks, and particularly this history textbook. And a little bit dwelling into the history of that, if you look at 1960s, in fact 1961 is the year where Professor Romila Thapar gets an invitation from UNESCO to review the then existing history textbooks in our country, and she had written a critique for them. And simultaneously, it is according to, in her own words, that there was also a committee which was set up, and the committee's conclusion and her critique had some semblance, because of which subsequently she was inducted in the committee on the invitation of none other than R.C. Majumdar, one of the illustrious historians of our country. And she goes on to say, this is in her article, which was published in the year 2009, with the title The History, Debate and School Textbooks in India. This was published in the year 2009, where she clearly says that this committee, which had initially formed, somehow it was not doing work in the pace that was desired by whom, it's not very clear. So much so that after a certain period in time, the entire committee was overhauled, that these committee's members were replaced, and the members who got into this, who were inducted for the second time in the committee. Earlier, the committee had people like Professor Neelakanthi Shastri, Irfan Habib, P.C. Gupta, and R.C. Majumdar, as I had said. And later, when this committee had undergone an overhaul, they had inducted members of, if I may say so, from their own category, R.S. Sharma, people of that ilk. This committee comprised of monolith kind of a thinking, and what followed was the textbook prescribed by this committee, which was chiefly written by Professor Romila Thapar, and she had categorically written for class 6 and class 7. And this was in vogue for at least 3 decades. Professor Thapar goes on to admit in her essay published in 2009 that it was a paramount struggle for liberals and historians to prevent India from becoming a Hindu kingdom. Unlike she cites the example of Pakistan becoming an Islamic state, she says that historians and liberals like her, it was a constant struggle for them to prevent India from becoming a Hindu nation state. So these are her statements. They are not paraphrased or cooked up by me here. So she says that somehow the textbooks and the way she had looked at the content to be delivered to our students in those textbooks were markedly different from the content that were presented by the historians who had worked before her. And she categorized them under the colonial tag, and she had mentioned that how the decoloniality had to happen in the textbooks, how we had to look at the intermixing culture, the dynamic movements that were happening before the British had laid their stronghold in our country. So in doing so, she justifies her way of approaching the history by saying that it is the act of decolonialization that she had embarked upon. So this is same echoed by Neeladri Bhattacharya in his essay as well. And he, of course, extends laudable comments to Romila Thapar. And now he justifies why in 2006 or 5 or 6, there needed another change. Because the textbook which were written by that committee of Romila Thapar, Irfan, Habib, R.S. Sharma, and others, but there were some revolts, there were some feedbacks, there were some, the way Romila Thapar describes it, that she was getting death threats, she was being vandalized, diatribes were written against her, against the committee, and but somehow when the government changed the NDA regime in 1999, there was a complete change of books in the curriculum. She writes she critiques it in a very harsh way, that overnight a lot of textbooks had appeared. And now Neeladri Bhattacharya, in 2009, in another essay in the same workshop series, he says that there was a dire need. In 2004, when the NDA government had collapsed and the UPA government had come, they had again reorganized the committee and asked the books to be rewritten. And this time it was under the chairmanship of Neeladri Bhattacharya for the history textbook. And he justifies now by saying that because in the last 3 decades there were a lot of turmoils, they needed a fresh look again to present history to our younger generations. Now, when we now look at, ever since these textbooks were rolled in the year 2008 and 9, at least more than 15 years have gone by. And when we look at it, there is not much of a change, because it is the same ideology, people with the same ideology who had continued in the committee, and it is just a rephrasing of certain sentences, juxtaposing of materials, maybe introduction of more pictures. Those mediums have changed, but the underlying content that is presented to our students through this textbook has in fact not undergone any change compared to how it was written by Romila Thapar. Now, what is the problem? There have been multiple generations, including mine, my previous generation, and several generations. We have studied through these textbooks, and we have been informed about our country's history through these ideological historians who have perhaps their own agenda to peddle through. How the agenda is being peddled through and not the history which is being presented in an objective manner. The book's name itself is questionable, because it says that it is our pasts, and the past is not in singular, but it is in a plural form. So there is a reason behind it, as told by Neeladri Bhattacharya, that they are now presenting history in a holistic manner. But essentially what they're doing is they want to give an impression to our students, saying that, you look, our history is not a linear story. It is convoluted, and it is all muddled up. In a sense that our students will get complete confused picture of our past. So this is in a way like a kind of whitewashing or erasing the past in order to give informations in bits and pieces, or in a very sketchy manner, not in a very not like presenting the facts and allowing the students to interpret for them. Of course, a student of class 6 will not have enough ammunitions or will not be sophisticated enough to interpret historical evidences with that temperament. But nevertheless, one cannot present the ideologies over sugarcoating them on the facts by saying that these are the objective facts of our past. So, and this is what Neeladri had to directly, I'm quoting from his essay, that temporalization was not simply a question of periodization. Now, this temporalization or periodization starts from James Mill, the early historian colonial historian who had written the history of British India. And there, perhaps for the first time, the temporalization, or what is referred to as periodization, starts, where Mill starts from the Hindu past, then the Muslim medieval period, and then the British period. So all these historians, including Neeladri Bhattacharya, they question this kind of straight-jacketed periodization, and they claim that this way of periodization is not correct way of presenting the history of our country. Why? Because he says, and I quote, it had deeper connotations. The question was, what did each of these periods signify? For the Hindu, right, the ancient period was a glorious time of Hindu civilization, and the Muslim period, within parenthesis, 1200 to 1800 current era, parenthesis closed, was a time of decline. The Hindu period was a time when Hindu philosophy and religion flowered, science and mathematics developed, the sacred texts of the Hindus were written, and Hindu culture spread outwards from India. All that is of value was to be discovered in the Hindu period, and all the traumas, conflicts, and problems of the present could be traced back to the Muslim period, when temples were destroyed, Hindus were oppressed, and the Hindu religion was under threat. In the textbooks of 1960s and 70s, historians persistently questioned these stereotypes. They unpacked the idea of glorious Hindu past and critiqued the notion of Muslim tyranny, unquote. So this is the clear agenda which he has presented, and he has no qualms about admitting it. What has been the motivation of this committee which had spearheaded the writing of the history textbook? Now again, to quote from his essay, Neeladri goes on to say that if the Hindu right represented the Muslim rulers as intolerant, oppressive, bigoted, and cruel, the secular textbooks showed that they were open-minded and tolerant, that they were patrons of Hindu shrines and arts, and they nurtured a syncretic culture. So this is clearly referring to the Somnath temple, where Professor Romila Thapar tried to show that how the Muslim invaders were not just had come to loot the temple, the looting the temples were kind of degeneralized, and as well as to portray how some of the Muslim kings, like even Tipu Sultan, or for that matter even Aurangzeb, went out of their way to patronize certain Hindu temples. So this is what Neeladri is echoing in this essay again, to show, and they are, as I said, they have no qualms in saying what was the secular agenda in the textbooks that we have been having in the last 50 years. Now again, I quote from Neeladri, the earlier textbooks were narratives of the nation. The idea of the unity of India was projected back into the past, and history was read as a gradual unfolding of the nation. Could we get away from this narrative? He poses a good question mark, and it baffles to me why at all should we get away from this narrative. Then he goes on to say, what could be the strategies to deploy? Which means they are having the agenda to get away from this narrative, and they're now discussing what could be the strategies that they could deploy to get away from this kind of a narrative. So he says that in the textbooks we offer, now when we say we offer, this is a textbook reformation that has happened from 2005. We offer no radical critique of the nation state, but we problematize the idea of the nation in a variety of ways. In the lower secondary class, that is from 6 to 8, we reframed the history of ancient, medieval, and modern India as our pasts 1, 2, and 3. This was to underline the multiplicity of histories and narratives that constitute the past, and to emphasize that there is no single linear narrative. There is no one national past that we can comfortably return to. Now, this may be opinion of an individual historian, but to project upon this as the history that our younger generations should study has got severe repercussions. And this is, as I said, Neeladri and his team has no qualms in putting this, coming out in public about their agendas, and this anybody could access as this essay is in the public domain. And as I said, this has been the agenda with which the textbooks were reformed. But even after this latest reformation that has happened in the year 2005, post which the textbooks were rolled, had come to print from 2009 onwards, we find a barrage of problems. And as I said, not because the ideology of this team has remained consistent, it is only the outward expression has found maybe certain pedagogical changes. Through this presentation, I am trying to highlight some of the few aberrations, errors of omission and commission that has crept in, and perhaps the ideological biases through which these textbooks try to inform our impressionable minds who are the future of our country. Now, let's take, for instance, this is our pasts, that is part 1, which is of class 6, and the very first chapter, this very famous bust or the statute of the priest king, which has been in the history textbooks from a very long period. But let's see if there is any change in the description. Now, the way this priest king is described in the current textbook is very interesting. He is introduced just as an important man, nothing beyond that. There are modern researches which go to prove that the society back then was much more egalitarian, if I may use the term egalitarian for that period, just mean that there was equal distribution of wealth. And also there are researchers which go on to link the Vedic tradition with the society back then and attribute this very statute to that of a king who is ready to perform a yaga. In fact, in this connection, there has been an Atharva presentation by another history scholar, and the presentation is in Hindi, who had argued or who had echoed the similar point. And I encourage our listeners to go to refer to that video for more details. There are other researchers which clearly attribute the Vedic connotations to this priestly king. But this textbook is completely silent on these aspects. And the conspicuous absence of the palace remains vast dwelling complexes, which, I mean, when the sites were excavated, some of the archaeologists and the historians had expressed a lot of surprise that they could not unearth or they could not excavate palace remains, which was the kind of, because they had these British archaeologists or the historians had the baggage of the British archaeology and the archaeology which were conducted in those countries. This again indicate a kind of a homogeneous nature of society that we have had. And in this chapter, this is chapter 3 that I'm referring to, there is absolutely no discussion of this sort at all, even in the textbooks that has been that they wanted to reform in 2005, saying that we would like to have a fresh look at our past. So this book is, as I said, completely silent on that. Moving ahead, in chapter 4, they introduce some of the Vedic concept, like there is a mention in chapter 4 that 3 gods are especially important: Agni, the god of fire; Indra, a warrior god; and Soma, a plant from which a special drink was prepared. This is in page 35. Now, to date, there is no clear understanding of what this Soma is. There are speculations about, ranging from a mushroom and all the way to a thing called ambrosia. Now, although there is no anthropomorphic depiction of this Soma, the fact that Soma elicited more than 100 hymns in the Rig Veda definitely points to the importance of this concept of Soma. But it is completely wrong to reduce it to a mere drink, as it is suggested in this textbook. So without getting into these nuances, our impressionable minds are just told the fact that, in fact, a wrong fact that Soma is a plant from which a special drink was prepared. Now it goes on to say how the Rigvedic Sanskrit is different from the Sanskrit that you people study today. It is just as an attempt to alienate the past in a different way, saying that Sanskrit was very different. But having mentioned that, immediately the next paragraph in that same chapter 3, I'm quoting from page 36, they mention how historians study the Rig Veda. Now, any curious reader or a student should ask that, having mentioned that the Rigvedic Sanskrit is very different, I wonder how the historians will have access to that Sanskrit. Forget the Rigvedic Sanskrit, leave alone the Rigvedic Sanskrit. How the historians will have access even to the Sanskrit? Because there are serious questions raised as about our ideologically vested historians about their knowledge of Sanskrit. Because to know about our past, it is imperative and mandatory that one needs to have thorough knowledge of the Sanskrit language to access all these texts. And these historians themselves, having declared that the Rigvedic Sanskrit is different, it is not at all clear how these historians studied the Rig Veda. That is again an anomaly that this presents. Likewise, there are several instances, like in a place where they introduce this concept of dasa and dasyu. It is very well established today that these terms do not connote bonded slaves, as it was in vogue in the European history or in the Middle East, Arabian history. But these dasas and dasyus, right from the 60s onwards, taking inspiration from Professor Romila Thapar's work, they continue to be connoted as bonded slaves. And among the several terms we understand today, dasa, it also means a servant, a fisherman, etc. So without resorting to these kind of nuances, I am not expecting the students to allude themselves to these nuances. But when these scholarly historians present this information to our younger generation, lots of due diligence must have had exhibited by them, analyzing through all these nuances before putting these statements to our impressionable mind, unless they have a specific agenda to peddle through. So they talk about the social differences, they introduce the class differences, and whenever there is a mention of Ashwamedha Yaga, they categorically mention that the Shudras or the lower caste people were excluded from these rituals. And this kind of exclusivity is mentioned in several places. And in fact, Professor Romila Thapar in 2009 in her essay, she categorically says that she was ridiculed or critiqued for talking about these subalterns, and she says that she was characterized as being immoral to our past. So it is in the same vein we see that even the textbooks, when they were kind of so-called reformed in 2005, there is not much of a difference in the way or the tone and the tenor with which they would like to inform about our past to our readers. Now, there are factual errors which they make, like in the instance, they in one place in chapter 3, again I'll talk about our pasts, class 6, part 1, they say the priests divided people into 4 groups and called varnas. Now, this is very baffling, because you have this Purusha Sukta, which itself says that the Purusha Sukta, there is a description about these 4 varnas, which comes. Bahura Janya Kritaha, Puru Tadase Yadvaishya, Padhyagam Shudro Ajayata. That's how it is described in the Purusha Sukta. In fact, the Bhagavad Gita also, there is a mention, Chaturvaranyamaya Srishti. This is what we often hear in several platforms. But what baffles me is that the historians have said it is the priests who have connoted all these things. Now, I see it as this is being done with an agenda in order to paint this quote-unquote priest with a negative connotation. The students now will kind of have a vilified approach to this word itself, priests. I think it is with that agenda that this kind of a allusion has happened in this case. Now, like that, as I said, there is a lot of class struggle which is being introduced in a very surreptitious manner, in a very, very subtle manner, but the impressionable mind to which they are interacting, they would do a lot of damage. And as I said, there have been multiple generations which have gone through this text. One last comment about this class 6, and I will close the class 6 and move on to class 7. It is that it is mentioned in chapter 5 in page 53 that, however, women, dasas and kammakaras could not participate in these assemblies. This is about agriculture, and kammakaras are one class of people whom they are introducing as a lower caste people, and this is how they are being excluded. Now, this repetitive portrayal of the excluded subaltern is actually bordering notoriety. So if I may say so, like in today's parlance, that if there is a board of directors meeting happening in any organization, now will sanitary workers be included in that meeting? Or will the minutes of the meeting mention who all were excluded from this meeting? Now, 50 years down the line, if somewhere to write the history of an institution and it is gauged through this minutes of the meeting of the board of directors, will it make any sense for the historian 50 years down the line to say the sanitary worker or the janitors were not included in this? So, however illogical it may sound, this is the same kind of illogic that these people are resorting to when they are mentioning about this. So, moving on to the class 7, as I said, this chapter, class 6, has got several such inconsistencies, but due to, I would not highlight each one of them. I'll quickly move on to now class 7 in this case. The class 7, again, it is our pasts and it is part 2. The very chapter, the first chapter begins with the term Hindustan. Now it says, I quote from the book, take the term Hindustan for example. Today we understand it as India, the modern nation state. When the term was used in the 13th century by Minhaj-e-Siraj, a chronicler who wrote in Persian, he meant the areas of Punjab, Haryana and the lands between Ganga and the Yamuna, unquote. Now it really baffles me as just a common reader, leave alone history buff or history enthusiast. Given that this is a history textbook by Indians to teach Indian kids, why there is absolutely no mention of the term Bharat? I mean, our own constitution says India, that is Bharat. There is absolutely no allusion to this term here, and the historians take pains to introduce this Minhaji-Siraj, a Persian chronicler, but have absolutely no mention about Mahabharata. Because why I'm saying Mahabharata is that there is a detailed exposition of our Indian landmass in Mahabharata text. You may not, these historians may not want to consider Mahabharata as an itihasa, which is translated as historical text. But this geographical description that is given in the Mahabharata, that has not drastically changed, except for that some places names have been altered. So why there is absolutely no allusion to it? And secondly, this fact that this the Akhanda Bharat description given in Mahabharata, the map, it in fact is used in the Purana Kila in the old Delhi. So with such realities, why that reality is not being reflected in our textbook is a serious question which baffles me. As I said, not just as a history enthusiast or a history buff, but even as a common reader, it completely baffles and pains me to see this kind of a cherry-picked agenda. So, although this in the Neeladri Bhattacharya alludes to the fact that students must be introduced to various sources which informs the historian, he wants the students to get the taste of historiography. But surprisingly, in this, at least in this class 7, our past part 2 textbook, lot of importance or reliance is given to only manuscript sources, and that too specifically manuscript or from the Persian chroniclers. I do not know why that kind of a skewed attention has been paid to. There is absolutely no mention of copper plates or stone inscription. Now, what I mean by that, this is I'm talking specifically about this chapter 1, and this chapter 1 they only focus upon paper manuscripts. There is no mention of that history can be inferred or delineated from even copper plates or stone inscription. But again, this again falls back because Professor Romila Thapar, she admits that much of the Hindu or the nationalist historians' narration have to be sieved through because there are a lot of fictions in it. Mythologies are intertwined. One has to sieve through the facts from these kind of writings. So the same similar sense is what is getting overflown in this era also, in this textbook era also. Then there are other factual errors like attributing the Persian wheel. Even today, it is being referred to as the Persian wheel or the spinning wheel, which is attributed to Persia. because the Fertile Crescent, which the archaeologists allude to, because supposedly the agriculture has taken its birth there, people feel that whatever innovation that had happened in connection with agriculture was confined to that area. But interestingly, there is one scholar by name T.M. Srinivasan who has researched about the ancient ways of water lifting, how the water lifting process was done, and he has specifically referred to the Rigvedic period as well as Arthashastra. And while at Arthashastra, Professor Romila Thapar, she has spent a considerable research on dating the Arthashastra, where she feels that the kernel portion of it is only the Mauryan period and most of it is the post-Mauryan period. That's again very much debatable because there are other researchers who have dated it much before the Mauryan period. But be that as it may, Professor T.M. Srinivasan has clearly shown that terms like Araghatti and Ghati were very much used in the period of Rigveda, and they were contrivances to have water lifting from a particular place and to be transported in a different place, like an irrigation mechanism. This is so. Our historians have absolutely no liking to such kind of facts, perhaps because they are completely silent on them. But this is just introduced that okay, Persia may have been the originator of this kind of a wheel, but at the same time, why don't you mention what was there in this Indian subcontinent as well? So, and not just that, because these historians justify this. They say in page 7 of chapter 1, quote, I quote, remember that all these innovations, new technologies and crops came along with people who brought other ideas with them as well, unquote. So they would like our students to believe that there was absolutely nothing indigenous and everything was imported. And this is something which we find it. You name anything of worth that we follow today, be it the dress that we wear or the food that we eat, it's the gift that has come from all our invaders. And in fact, this is factually wrong. This is not just an emotional outburst or emotional or a passionate statement that somebody is making or I'm making here. When you present facts, I mean, we need to look at facts from from a very objective manner. So then again, this Marxist obsession about class struggle, about jati, those things are again repeated in a much more vociferous manner. But what I would like to clearly draw your attention to specifically is the way the Sanskrit is introduced. The book says the following. This is in page number 10. There's a small fact box like a entry in the book. It says, in 1318, the poet Amir Khusro noted that there was a different language in every region of this land. Sindhi, Lahori, Kashmiri, so on and so forth. The textbook quotes Khusro's work. And then he says, the textbook says, Amir Khusro went on to explain that in contrast to these languages, there was Sanskrit which did not belong to any region. Okay? It was an old language and common people do not know it, only the Brahmins do. This last portion, that is common people do not know it, only the Brahmins do, is presented as though it is the words of Amir Khusro, and the authors of this textbook are reproducing him verbatim. Now see the kind of notoriety that these people play. Now, if only they had inserted the word particular and said Sanskrit which did not belong to any particular region, there is a complete diametric opposite sense of the meaning that the sentence convey. When we insert the word particular, it says that Sanskrit was indeed Sarvavyapi, it was like omnipresent. It didn't belong to any particular region. Vis-a-vis, saying the way it is written in textbook, that Sanskrit which did not belong to any region. It is like to say it is like floating in the air, alien language. It did not, nobody owned it. This is what is the sense, a simple English, at least to my simple mind, it conveys the same. Now again, see the way the textbook goes. It quotes Khusro by saying, common people do not know it, only the Brahmins do. Now, if you look at some people, see the kind of a notoriety these people played. Okay, I mean, if you look at the past 500 years, thousands of compositions have been made in Sanskrit. Okay, thousands. I mean, if not thousands, if not millions, and at least thousands of compositions have been made. Now, if it and at no given point in time in our past, the Brahmin population actually exceeded 5%. Now, if it was really confined or it was only a feature of the Brahmins, why for this tiny minuscule there will be lakhs and crores of Sanskrit compositions? Be that as it may. You look at some of the contemporaries of Khusru. One such person is King Simha Bhupala. He is from the Racharla clan of the Andhra dynasty. And he's today remembered. He's famous for two works. One is he wrote a tika. He wrote a commentary for Sangita Ratnakara of Sharakadeva. And this tika of Sangita Ratnakara is even followed today in the curriculum. The other work which Simha Bhupala wrote is Rasarnava Sudhakara. Both are in Sanskrit. He is a 14th century guy, contemporary to Amir Khusru. Okay, Amir Khusru may not have had the knowledge about him, but where is the knowledge of this committee or the historians who wrote this textbook? Forget introducing King Simha Bhupala, who wrote in Sanskrit. And it's an interesting fact to say that Simha Bhupala, while introducing the text of Rasarnava Sudhakara, he writes, Tasya padam bujat jato varno vigata kalmashaha yasya sodaratam praptam bhagiratha tapap phalam. He introduces himself as a padam bujat jato, from jinke charan kamal se hum nikle hain. He is referring to his caste as a Shudra caste. He had no qualms in admitting that. Again, it gives a lot of information about the societal dynamics at that time. First, he has no qualms to admit that he's a Shudra. Second, he writes it in Sanskrit. Third, society has accepted it. Otherwise, it would not have stood the test of time and reached us at this point in time. Second, you look at, forget this contemporary of Khusru. Okay, Amir Khusru might not have traveled that extensively to the country, but if Amir Khusru had some sense for history, if he had some sense to write about a nation which had survived for several thousands of years even before he had come, he had just to look at 200 years before his period into the work called Vikramanka Devacharita by Bilhana, who was from 11th century. And this is what Bilhana has to write in his Vikramanka Devacharita. Brumah Saraswata Kula Bhuvaha Kimnidhe Kautukanam Tasya Neka Bhuta Guna Katha Kirna Karnamritasya Yatra Strinam Api Kimaparam Janma Bhasha Vadeva Pratyavasam Vilasati Vachaha Samskritam Prakritam Cha. Okay, so here Bilhana announces Yatra Strinam Api Kimaparam Janma Bhasha Vadeva Samskritam Prakritam Cha. In all and sundry, including women, because there is again a theory, the dramaturgist who had looked at our Sanskrit drama from the Western point of view, that women were speaking in Prakrit and the noble characters were speaking in Sanskrit. I mean, leaving aside all those topics, here is historical evidence or literary evidence from Bilhana saying that everybody knew Sanskrit. Then how it was confined to only the Brahmins, as his textbook wants to, as Amir Khusru had looked at, and the textbook reproduces dutifully Amir Khusru's word. One more proof or one more evidence. This is again from 11th century, from a work called Knowhow by King Bhojadeva, who in the second chapter of this Knowhow says, Ke bhuvan nadhya rajasya rajye prakrita bhashinaha kale sri sahasankasya kena samskritavadina. So he is in 11th century, he is referring to Kale sahasankasya, referring to Vikramaditya, who lived thousands of years before the author, before Bhojadeva, and says, since his time, who is there who does not speak Sanskrit? Kena samskritavadina. Now, one may say that this is just a poetic license that these people have employed, and this lokokti or a kind of an exaggeration that these people have resorted to. But at least one should take cognizance of these historical pieces of evidence. That forget Amir Khusru referring to them. Even in 2005 to 9, our own contemporary historians have not bothered to look at them and inform our students. Present all these things and let the students make a decision of themselves. That is not being done here. Let's move ahead. The other very characteristic work that we had the good fortune of having in the recent past was from Dharampa. And these ideologically vested historians have not referred to him even once. Why I'm alluding to Dharampal's work here is that in chapter 4 of his book, The Beautiful Tree, he has given the caste-wise distribution of male and female students who were getting education in the early 19th century. Okay, and the table is what is shown on the screen, from where you can clearly see the caste-wise distribution. Now, was it in the 18th century where they're learning Shakespeare, or in the 18th century where they're learning some German or French texts? These are definitely the Sanskrit texts, and you have language-wise description of who was studying what. Okay, forget Bhojadeva's Kanthabharana or even Vikramanka Devacharita, which are thousands of years old. Why can't our historians look at this Dharampal's work? This is not Dharampal's opinion. All that Dharampal has done is he has reproduced from the archives of the British officers. And our students are not presented these facts at all. Rather, they are presented with the fact that what Amir Khusro said, that Sanskrit is confined only to the Brahmins. Now, in the chapter, same chapter 1 of our past part 2, in page 12, the textbook says the following. This was also the period when new religions appeared in the subcontinent. Merchants and migrants first brought the teachings of the Holy Quran to India in the 7th century. Muslims regard the Quran as their holy book and accept the sovereignty of the one God, Allah, whose love, mercy, and bounty embrace all those who believe in Him without regard to social background. Unquote. And in the same page, while describing Islam, the textbook says, I quote, and like Hinduism, Islam was interpreted in a variety of ways by its followers, unquote. Now, I have no problem. This is the right way of introducing any religion. And Islam is always also introduced in this way. But then look at the antecedents. How have you introduced Hinduism to our students? In the whole gamut of our past one, which is in class 6, how have you introduced, when I say you, or how have these authors introduced Hinduism to our students? It is through the class struggle. It is that the low caste or the Shudras were avoided. It is that the kings were constantly fighting. So you are giving a colored picture, and you choose what color has to be painted to which religion. But when it comes to, in this case, the Abrahamic religion, and in this page, the Muslim or the Islam, you have these kind of words to introduce them. As I said, I repeat, had these authors done the due diligence to introduce Hinduism in such a very positive note to our students, perhaps I would not be having this much of effort or this much of emotion while presenting these facts. Now, this second quotation, which I said, that like Hinduism, Islam was interpreted in a variety of ways by its followers. There's a reason why our authors have resorted to this sentence. Now, there's a very strict, classical difference between the interpreters. Yes, of course, there were different interpreters of Islam, and there have been different interpreters of Hinduism. So this kind of gives a false equivalence to our student, that you look, as there are different interpreters in Hinduism, there are different interpreters in Islam, so there is nothing wrong. They both are equivalent. But let me ask a question. Are these different interpreters of Hinduism, be it in the Vasishta Advaita, Dvaita, or the Advaita part, did they kill one another to establish their superiority of the ideas, like the different interpreters of Islam, the struggle which we see even to this day? Our students are not presented with these facts. Of course, they may be provocative fact, but why do they want to draw a false equivalence between these two religions? That is something which I say it is like a ideological brainwashing that the textbook is attempting at doing. Going ahead, in chapter 2, talking about how inaccuracies have crept in along with the ideological vested interests. In page 21, I quote, the best known Chahamana ruler was Prithvi Raja III, 1168 to 1192 in the current era, who defeated an Afghan ruler named Sultan Muhammad Ghori in the year 1191, but lost to him the very next year in 1192, unquote. Chahamanas, by the way, are the Chauhan rulers, and this is the very famous fight that happens between Prithviraj and Muhammad Ghori. I reiterate what the textbook says. It says Prithviraj defeated Ghori in 1191, but lost to him in the very next year. So what do you conclude? There were two wars which were fought. The first one, Prithviraj won, and the second one, Prithviraj lost. That is a simple inference that we draw from here. This is what the text directly says. But what does the history really say? Now, there's a very authoritative historian, Professor R.P. Singh, who had written a book on the rule of the Chahamana rulers. The book's name is displayed on the screen, The History of the Chahamanas, the battle between Prithviraj III and Ghori. According to this historian, this battle between Prithviraj III and Muhammad Ghori is one of the naughtiest problem in our Indian history. There's a reason why he called this as a naughtiest problem, which I have tried to assimilate or summarize in this tabular column, which is shown in front of you, that there are as many as 10 different accounts of the war or the fight between Prithviraj III and Muhammad Ghori. The authors of these different accounts are given here. And according to these different authors, like the Prithviraj Raso, the book name written by a Hindu writer, there were 21 battles between Prithviraj Chauhan and Muhammad Ghori. But this historian, Professor R.P. Singh, says there are several inconsistencies in this book, and he considers this as not a reliable source. Then when you look at the Jain work called Hambira Mahakavya, it mentions only 9 battles. And this historian says this is a reliable source. Similarly, the Prithviraj Prabandhana mentions 9, and this historian has no negative comments about it. But when it comes to the Prithviraja Kosha by the Hindu author, it mentions about again 21 battles, and this author says this is a traditionally accepted number of 21 battles between Prithviraj Chauhan and Muhammad Ghori. But look at the drastic pattern change when it comes to Jamiul Hakiyat or Tajul Ma'asir, Tabakat-e Nasiri, or book by Firishta. All these 4 are by Muslim authors. And they mention only either one battle, which was won by Muhammad Ghori, or at the most they mention 2 battles. That is one where Muhammad Ghori lost, and the second one where Muhammad Ghori won. Now we can understand all these Muslim authors, be it the author of Jamiul Hakiyat to book by Firishta, they were working under the Muslim kings. So they have perhaps had certain compulsions to please their patrons, and because of which they might have concocted the number of battles and presented it in this manner. But what compulsions do an objective committee under a secular government have, which has not presented these facts and has presented only the versions that these Muslim authors write? This is something which is, as I said, it borders really notoriety, and the agenda of our the committee and the textbook writers are nakedly seen in this kind of portrayals. Talking about this Chahamana, this historian, Professor R.B. Singh, he writes that among the early Muslim writers, a deep-rooted hatred for the Hindus was present, and for whom they always used a contemptuous language, and they carefully tried to avoid any reference to the defeat and dishonor of the army of Islam. Now let's look at the other highly inaccurate portrayal of one of our historical icons, and this time it is even more important. Why? Because it is the Queen Rudramamba, who perhaps in the history of the world there is no other second example for her valor as well as the long duration with which she held the kingdom under her kingship. But look at the way she is introduced in the textbook, the very textbook. Okay, this is in chapter 3. Now, before introducing Rudramamba, of course, that she is being introduced in a very passing manner. But before that, who is introduced? Queen Razia. How she is introduced? The textbook says, Minhaji Siraj thought that the queen's rule went against the ideal social order created by God, in which women were supposed to be subordinate to men. He therefore asked, in the register of God's creation, since her account did not fall under the column of men, how did she gain from all her excellent qualities? So the textbook goes on to say that on her inscriptions and coins, Razia mentioned that she was the daughter of Sultan Iltutmish. And this, now, till here there is introduction of Razia. And the textbook also says that the scholars at that time, or the people at the helm of the affairs at that time, did not like Razia to be at the top, at the helm of affairs. So, of course, Razia's rule did not last longer, and she had to be overthrown. But then you look at how immediately Rudramamba Devi is introduced after having introduced Razia. This was in contrast to Queen Rudrama Devi, ruling from 1262 to 1289 of the Kakatiya dynasty of Warangal, part of modern Andhra Pradesh. What is in contrast? That Rudrama Devi changed her name on her inscriptions and pretended she was a man. Okay. Now, this is a concocted version of the history. And unfortunately, even there is in the visual media also, there is a movie made in the Tollywood among the Telugu speaking people, that this kind of a concocted or a completely wrong portrayal of Rudrama Devi is what is being put forward. Now, there are enough evidences to show that this is wrong. So at the outset, Rudrama Devi did not change her name, and she issued inscriptions and coinage she did not indulge in issuing coin or inscriptions under the changed name. And this, whatever has happened in the book as well as in the movie, it's a blatant lie. The father's name was Ganapati Deva, and he had earned the honorific Raja Gajakesari. And Rudrama Devi, she had rightly inherited this title. And and this befitted her stellar accomplishments as well. And in her inscriptions, she is referred to as Raya Gajakesari. And later, actually what had happened, she had only daughters and she did not have sons. And she had adopted her grandson, whose name was Prataparudra, as the heir to the throne. And when she had announced that Prataparudra is heir to the throne, Prataparudra was an infant, or maybe just a very small child. And there are inscriptions bearing the name of Kumara Rudradeva. So this is a period. A coin or inscription is issued by the name Kumara Rudradeva. Rudrama Devi is still holding on to the throne. She has announced her grandson Prataparudra as the heir to the throne. So this is a scenario. But what has happened is some of the early historians have jumped to the conclusion that Kumara Rudradeva is a changed name by which Rudrama Devi had issued her coins and inscriptions. So then there arose the confusion. So there are these kind of evidences to show. So now what you see on the screen are those evidences which show that this kind of lie, what is portrayed in our textbook is a lie. So it's like South Indian inscription in volume 10, the Telugu inscription from the Madras Presidency by this Ramaya Pantulu. This is inscription number 422 of Shaka era 1191, which is corresponding to 1269 in the current era. And it mentions Rudrama Mahadevi and Pattodhati. Pattodhati, of course, is not inferred yet, of Ganapati Deva. So there is absolutely no confusion here. So it is clearly mentioned Rudrama Mahadevi. So this is a female name, and it is the name of Rudrama Devi here. Similarly, if you look at the other inscription, where Swasti Sri Kakati show Ganapati Nripatihi, Tasya Sa Rudramamba. This is a Prashasti again, but then this is not shying away from mentioning that she is Rudramamba, Putri Laukeka Virajanihi. So it says Putri. So there is absolutely no confusion here as well. Then there is another inscription where she is mentioned Rudrama Mahadevi. So it is very unambiguous and unequivocal in saying she had not changed her name also. And there is another inscription, that Kulavachari inscription of Anidalli states that after Ganapati's death, his daughter Rudrama Devi protected the earth as well as he did. Pitaryu Parate Tadva Tadvat Rakshad Akhilam Kshitim Veera Rudrama Devi iti Duhita Mahita Gunaihi. So what more evidence do our historians need? But no, the textbook writers would like to contrast Rudrama Devi against Razia, to portray Rudrama Devi as somebody inferior to Razia, because Razia was not a hypocrite. Okay, her rule did not last. Why? Because she was living in a patriarchal society, a masochistic society, so she had to be brought down. But you look, she was not hypocrite like Rudrama Devi. Why? Because Rudrama Devi had to change her name to survive in this patriarchal society. Now, what more blatant lie can this textbook carry and change the impressions of our past from our amidst our impressionable minds? And needless to mention about this Delhi Iron Pillar, the textbook does not mention a single word about the temple complex which was raised down in order to raise this Qutub Minar, and how this iron pillar was transplanted from Udayagiri, Vishnupada temple, from how it was transplanted from there to this current place in Mehrauli. The textbook is absolutely silent. It really baffles. I mean, why it should be silent? And again, I resort back to the rationale that is given by Neeladri, that in the 1960s, when the first time this textbook reformation was happening, that they had suffered from the scars of partition, where Hindus were killing Muslims and the Muslims were killing Hindus. So the textbook writers of that time tried to portray or underplay the communal picture of our past and try to project as much of secular values as possible. But now in 2009, is this the way to project the secular values? That you completely downplay, completely obscure the Hindu past and only project the Abrahamic thoughts? Is that anyway logical, or is it even ethical? A country like Germany, if somebody has to deny the Holocaust, denial is a statutory crime. You can be tried and put behind the bars if you are found to deny the Holocaust. But here in our country, in the name of this oft-quoted Ganga Jamuni Tehzeeb, you have done such a big whitewash. These historians have done such a big whitewash in the textbook and have produced generations after generations students of who have been informed only of this kind of a history, where the priest class is villainized, where all the greatest achievements that has happened in the Gupta era, not a single mention about them. This textbook has the cheek to mention Iron Pillar, but it has no sentence to praise the artisanship or the metallurgical advancement that our forefathers has had thousands of years before. So such kind of errors are galore in the textbooks. What I have presented in the last few minutes are only tiny snippets of the errors. There are, as I said, scores and scores of factual errors. So if I can lay my hands on these kind of experimental evidences to say that the facts being presented in the textbook are lopsided, I wonder what kind of research or what kind of a scholarly rigor that this textbook team had when they had taken the project in their under their control to write the textbook for our school textbooks. So be it in terms of glorifying the Muslim rulers, be it in terms of villainizing the Sati Pratha, absolutely no mention of Jauhar. They even go on to vilify the Chola kings. In chapter 5, they talk about kings, different kings and different kingdoms. And they do talk about the Rajaraja Chola, but in a very, the proportion with which they talk about the southern kingdoms, or even for that matter the Ahom kingdom, are very much low. But the factual error that I'm trying to present here is very interesting. They present the Muslim kings, of course, and when they come to this the question of the issue of southern kingdom, they said that I quote, notice how the names of the ruler and the god are very similar. The king took the god's name because it was auspicious and he wanted to appear like a god. Though the rituals of worship in the temple, one god, Rajaraja Deva, honored another, Rajarajeshwaram. Unquote. So, and the same chapter, little further, if we go, this was in page 63. In page 64, it says, Muslim sultans and the padshahs did not claim to be incarnations of God, but Persian court chronicles describe the sultan as the shadow of God. So you see how Rudramamba was contrasted against Razia and how she was shown how she was shown inferior to Razia because she was a hypocrite and Razia was not. Here you look at how our Chola kings have been contrasted against the Muslim sultans. So whereas because the bigger temple in Tanjavur, it is called Brihadishwara temple, it is also called as Rajarajeshwaram. Shiva in the Garbhagriha is called the Rajarajeshwaram. The textbook says that this king announced themselves as the incarnation of Shiva. Now this is the imagination, this is the product of a fertile imagination. It's a pure work of fiction because no inscription or no historical work has ever claimed that Rajaraja Chola declared himself as an incarnation of Shiva. All that he has done, he has called himself as Shivapada Shekhara. But you see how he is contrasted. He is contrasted against Muslim kings and sultans who say, the textbook says, who did not claim to be incarnations of God, but Persian court chronicles called them as the shadow of God. So what more needs to be said? How the committee is interested in introducing our kings and the Muslim kings who had invaded us. Finally, I would like to close my presentation. Chairman of the university, the first perhaps the University Education Commission, which was drafted once the country became independent. This was in 1948, and this is what he had to say. No nation is healthy that parts company with its traditions. Social development is an organic process. The continuing influence of the past on the present cannot be ignored. Our art and literature, our law and history belong to the mainstream of our culture. Every Indian student should get to know the main outlines of the history of India, which is not a mere chronicle of dates and defeats, of follies and failures. He should know the lives of heroes who express the spirit of our civilization, the seers of the Vedas, the Buddha and Shankara. So he says that every chronicle of follies and failures, what I'm just alluding here to is in the class 7, there is an introduction of how Islam came to India through the western coast. Well, although it is not directly referred, but the Cheraman Mosque is what is being referred, but it has been proved that the Cheraman Mosque is a product of fiction, just like the St. Thomas Mount is a product of fiction. But here, what really pains or what is more baffling to note is that the entry of Islam through the northwest frontier is not mentioned in the way it should be mentioned for our kings, the Kashmir kings, the Lalitaditya, Chandrapida, Kumarapida. Generations of king had resisted the Islamic invasion for centuries together, which finally, ultimately, the Prithviraj Chauhan's period, we see that much of inroad happens. But our book does not mention the word or the name of one of the Kashmiri kings, Lalitaditya or Kumarapida. The chairman of the Education Commission had envisaged, and for his vision to fulfill, which I feel has not yet been happened, I have some optimistic outlook through this National Education Policy 2020, where this is the right time to amend and realize the vision of Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan. With that, I thank Atharva Forum for this wonderful opportunity, and I thank you all for your patient listening. Namaste.